A new clue is unlocked in the mystery surrounding the disappearance of a Texas mom of 4. It's the latest development as the woman's husband sits in a jail cell accused of her murder, despite her body still not being found. Law&Crime has covered this case since the beginning. In October, Suzanne Simpson vanished without a trace after returning home from a party in San Antonio, Texas. Police say on the night of October 6, she and her husband Brad Simpson got into an argument, and she hadn't been seen or heard from since. Initially, Brad was arrested and charged with assault causing bodily injury, family violence, and unlawful restraint. But those charges were later upgraded to murder, despite Suzanne's body still not being found. Since her disappearance, police seemingly have a lot of evidence stacked against the father of 4. But this new piece of evidence could possibly give more insight into what happened to Suzanne. Family members told news station KNS5 they were alerted by law enforcement the realtor's DNA was found on a motorized saw. According to the indictment against Brad, he allegedly tried to conceal the saw a day before he was arrested. It's unclear at this time how he tried to conceal the power tool, leaving yet another mystery in the case. Police say Brad has remained uncooperative throughout the investigation, but the timeline pieced together by authorities is seemingly painting a sinister picture. In August, 2 months prior to her disappearance, Suzanne allegedly told her personal banker her husband had been physically abusive. She reportedly said Brad would often take her cell phone and that her husband would tell their children she had lost her phone. Suzanne even made an eerie statement to the banker, saying if she ever went missing, to look for her in a lake. According to police, the following month, Brad messaged an unidentified woman saying, "I still feel bad about tonight. I never should have grabbed her phone," and drove off because she was protective of it. That woman later told investigators Suzanne was aware her husband would track her and that he was extremely jealous. On the day Suzanne disappeared, the couple and their 5-year-old daughter went to a party in Alamo Heights, where witnesses claimed to have seen the couple get into an argument while at the party. After Suzanne and her daughter left the party to go to the grocery store, surveillance footage obtained by police reportedly showed her in the store from 8:40 to 8:51 p.m., and they left. By 9:15 that night, Suzanne called a family friend saying she was coming over. But a minute later, she reportedly called her mom to tell her Brad had just assaulted her and he had caused pain to her arm, neck, and back. At 9:25 that night, she arrived to the family friend's house. But half an hour later, everything would change. After 10 p.m. that night, a neighbor saw Brad and Suzanne in a heated argument where the neighbor witnessed a physical struggle. The neighbor saw Suzanne trying to get away from Brad. He reportedly chased after his wife and was trying to grab her. Then the neighbor heard loud screams coming from a wooded area near the couple's home. Police say around 10:22 that evening, Suzanne's Find My app showed her at her home, which was the last location listed for her on the app. That same neighbor told police they saw Brad get into his pickup truck, leave the home, and returned about an hour later. The heated and potential final argument might have been witnessed by the couple's youngest daughter. The following day, their 5-year-old daughter told a school counselor her dad pushed her mom against the wall, hit her in the face, and hurt her mom's elbow inside, then turned off her mom's phone because they were fighting. But earlier that morning, shortly after midnight, Brad and his truck were seen on surveillance video at a San Antonio H-E-B, and his truck bed was clear of everything except a large ice chest. At 7:53 that same morning, surveillance video captured Brad's truck dropping off his daughter at school, and the truck bed contained 2 white trash bags and a large ice chest. Shortly before 9:15 that same morning, his truck was seen on a drive-through camera at Whataburger in Kendall County, Texas. Surveillance footage reportedly showed 3 white trash bags, a heavy-duty trash can, an ice chest, and a bulky item wrapped and secured in blue tarp that was held down by a firewood rack in the back of Brad's truck. According to investigators, Brad then made some questionable purchases. He bought 2 bags of cement, a construction bucket, a box of heavy-duty trash bags, Clorox spray, and insect repellent with cash at a nearby Home Depot. But right before he bought the items, he allegedly asked someone in the parking lot for directions to the nearest dump in Boerne, Texas, which is a little more than half an hour away from San Antonio. He tried to cover his tracks, and during that time, he reportedly shut off his cell phone, but his truck was seen near the Kendall County solid waste site. Around 11:15 that morning, his truck was seen at a gas station. However, the white trash bags were missing from his truck. The blue tarp, firewood rack, and trash can, though, were still in his vehicle. He made a clothing change, too. According to investigators, he went from black sandals to dark-colored cowboy-styled boots. Then hours later, Brad was seen picking up his daughter from school, but police say his truck bed was clear of the blue tarp and metal firewood rack. He also washed and cleaned the driver's front side and rear passenger side of the truck at a car wash back in San Antonio. But for Suzanne's loved ones, they began to pick up that something was off when they didn't hear from her and when she didn't pick her daughter up from school, something she did routinely. By this time, Brad didn't call 911 or report his wife missing, so Suzanne's friend called police. Brad ended up calling police, though, and left a voicemail. When they returned his call, Brad reportedly told them he hadn't seen or heard from his wife since the night before. Brad was arrested on October 9th, 3 days after Suzanne was last seen alive. But police believe he killed his wife on the 6th. Texas Rangers executed a search warrant on the Simpsons' Olmos Park home. That's when a ranger saw an indention located on the wall at the bottom of the stairway. One of the Simpsons' daughters told police that damage was recent and wasn't there when she previously visited the home. And later that day, when the Rangers searched Brad's property in Bandera County, they found a ground-level burn site with a burnt laptop and multiple cell phones. Rangers confirmed there was a positive match for blood inside Brad's truck, but later learned the blood belonged to Brad. The case would take another turn when Brad's friend and business partner, James Val Cotter, was arrested weeks after Brad's arrest. Cotter was charged with tampering with evidence and possessing a prohibited weapon after agreeing to hide an AK-47 for Brad in the wall of his home 2 days after Suzanne's disappearance. Cotter was eventually released from jail after posting a $100,000 bond, but he was later indicted on those charges. As for Brad, though, he remains behind bars. The San Antonio father faces several charges, including murder, aggravated assault with a deadly weapon causing serious bodily injury to a family member, tampering with a corpse, tampering with physical evidence, and possession of a prohibited weapon, which could carry a sentence anywhere from 2 to the rest of his life in prison if he's convicted. But for Brad and Suzanne's children, their lives have forever been destroyed. The couple's 2 youngest children are reportedly living with their aunt and uncle. During his initial court hearing since his arrest, the father of 4 was asked by a judge where his wife might be. Initially, Brad told the judge she was in Austin with friends, but during a second hearing, he pleaded the 5th. With Brad still reportedly uncooperative with the investigation, it's leaving Suzanne's loved ones with many unanswered questions, including where is she and what happened to her. And with the mystery surrounding where Suzanne Simpson is, let's bring on retired NYPD detective and host of the Gold Shields podcast. That's Tom Smith. Tom, always great to see you, and thanks for joining me. It's been more than 2 months since Suzanne Simpson was last seen alive. Her husband is behind bars for her murder. Talk to me about where an investigation like this goes from here.
Well, right now, because of not having a body, you're just going to really concentrate on the prosecution part and building that case up, even without the body, which you can do. A lot of people don't realize that, but you can bring a murder charge against someone without actually recovering the body. And that's what they did here because of all the circumstantial evidence and now the DNA evidence that has been brought. But it's just continuing the investigation, and you hope at some point it leads to her discovery, whether it's a deal they make, with him or whatever it might be. But right now, to answer your question, is just continuing the investigation to a prosecutional part.
And what do you make of Suzanne Simpson's DNA being found on that motorized saw? Does that give you clues as to what happened to her, or do you think that there could be another reason her DNA was found on that saw?
No, I think we can all kind of conclude horribly what happened with that, because your DNA just doesn't end up on a saw. That just doesn't happen. And unfortunately, in this case, it did, or fortunately for the prosecution, it did. Because, mistakes get made by people who aren't career criminals. And when they think they have everything covered and it's all taken care of, it's not. And this day and age, with how high-tech DNA recovery is, I'm glad they got it.
Yeah, and the area where Suzanne and Brad are from, it's lots and lots of miles of land and dirt. It's very rural in some parts once you get outside of the San Antonio area. How difficult does that make searching for remains, especially since it's been months now?
Oh, it's extremely difficult. And you know what? That's what I said before. At this point, when so much was done with the search, you're going to really rely on a deal that's made. And that happens quite often when there's murders, when there's serial murders, going to the person involved and making some sort of deal and recovering the body, at least for the families. Listen, you're going to jail regardless, but you actually can more or less dictate how long, or if there's a death penalty involved in it. All those deals can be made to give peace to the family with some sort of recovery.
And you had mentioned something interesting in our conversation earlier about circumstantial evidence. And there does seem to be a lot of evidence stacking against Brad. You have the surveillance footage, you have the motorized saw, their children's statements, even. Then you have the statement Suzanne allegedly made to her banker, if I ever go missing, you'll find me in a lake. That doesn't seem like something you kind of make in a joking manner, given she told close friends her husband was abusive. But what do you make of all of that mountain of evidence kind of pointing to something sinister and to the murder of Suzanne Simpson?
Yeah, well, investigators, detectives rely on that. It doesn't always have to be just pinpointed, statements that are made showing someone's guilt. Circumstantial evidence can build up to the timeline, to the, time frame of when this happened, his comings and goings. Everyone today is on video somewhere. Then you see the bags and you see the ice chest, and he tries to kind of cover it a little by just acting normal and going to McDonald's and everything, but he doesn't realize that that leads to the timeline. And that's what I mean by people who panic and aren't used to covering steps up when it involves a crime make many, many mistakes. And he did. And circumstantial evidence adds up after a while, and it's good enough to bring to court in a prosecution.
And, sometimes I can't go necessarily into the minds of a criminal or an alleged criminal in this case. But when Suzanne was first reported missing, her husband was uncooperative with the investigation and reportedly still is. How difficult does that make an investigation like this if you have a defendant slash husband not working with police? Because you would think that someone who is trying to get away with a murder, especially since you went through all that great lengths of, possibly allegedly disposing of a body, but then, you're tight-lipped with police kind of not giving them any type of leeway to make them even think it's somebody other than you.
Yeah, you know what? It's strange, and this is going to be odd to say, but a lot of times when it comes to this, detectives don't care what he says because there's so much other stuff to do in gathering evidence. And then once you start compiling the evidence and the timeline, he did it. Detectives will have a mindset of, okay, we got him. Let's just figure out how we're going to prosecute him and get him. Whether he says something or not, yes, it's always better to get a statement from him. But detectives aren't 100% just relying on that because there's so much more to do. That just is part of, it's kind of on the checklist of investigations. And if it happens to work out your way, great. If it doesn't, they just continue what they're doing and it ends up being where they are right now.
And in hopes of investigators possibly finding her remains, what type of leverage do you think that they could present to Brad to either tell them, this is where she is, or at least point them in the right direction?
Yeah, when you end up in cases like this with trying to get or make a deal or somehow get the information from him, a lot of times it involves taking the death penalty off the table and just living your last years in jail and not being executed. A lot of times in these cases, that's kind of the tipping point with giving up information, especially when it comes to bodies and recovery.
And, this case similarly mirrors another case in Massachusetts with Brian Walsh. It's kind of literally the same circumstances. They have young children at home. They're married. The wife goes missing, hasn't been seen since. In Brian Walsh's case, it's been a year longer than Suzanne Simpson's case. But both of those cases I find interesting in the way that you have a husband who allegedly murders their wife with children still in the home when this could have possibly occurred. What do you make of just that personal level of brutality, given that, not only you go to great lengths to kill allegedly your wife, but at the same time dispose of her remains to the point investigators haven't found the bodies in both of those cases?
Yeah, it's pretty chilling. But when you get into that level of domestic abuse, the abusers don't care who's around, whether it's kids, whether it's other family members or whatever. They're just so tuned into the violent acts that they're committing and whatever mental problems they're going through at the time. But that's the sad part. They get so tunneled into what they're doing, they don't care who's home. And that's why, we've talked about it before on other shows with you, Elizabeth, that, when you do these notifications of deaths, they become interviews. And it's the same with the children. The children become not only explaining what's happening, but getting a backstory of what it was like in that house. And they can provide a lot of information.
And say this case goes to trial, what's going to be the thing that prosecutors, in your opinion, are going to be focusing on more? Is it going to be this overmounting or this mounting evidence against Brad Simpson, or do you think it's going to be kind of the witness statements possibly from either the children or the neighbor who heard the fighting? What do you think is going to be more important to build their case?
Well, it all leads down to the final part. So you have the history of domestic abuse, you have her statements to her friends, you have the children's statements about what happened. Then the next part is all the surveillance video. So then you time all that in and line all that up. Then at the end, you have the DNA evidence. So it kind of all layers into one another, coming up to the finish line when it comes to the prosecution. And it all gets into a nice package. And this case, unfortunately for the victim, but fortunately for the prosecution, it reads very well. You start in one spot with the domestics, the video, the DNA, and it just leads to a great picture of what happened.
And I guess we'll have to wait and see how this all continues to play out. Tom, I want to thank you so much for your insight into this case. Before we sign you off, though, do you think that there's hope Suzanne Simpson will be found?
Yes, you know what? A lot of times the guilt of not giving up where she is, they were married and they do have children. So you hope that comes into his head at some point and just lets the children have the proper burial and the proper services and her family to say goodbye to her. And most of the time that does happen. And I hope it does in this case.
Well, Tom, again, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Anytime. Thank you for having me.
At this time, Brad Simpson remains behind bars in the Bexar County Jail, held on a more than $2 million bond. Reporting for Law and Crime, I'm Elizabeth Millner.